Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Human Mosaic, the show where each story is a unique tile that fits into the bigger picture. I'm your host, Caillou Rivera, and today I unfortunately do not have a guest, nor am I showing video, but I wanted to briefly touch on a topic that's really important to me, that being grief. I experienced a pretty traumatic loss of my grandmother, who was basically my mother, 2.5 years ago. And ever since then, kind of just struggling to process grief and how to go about doing that. And so, being that today is her birthday, I really wanted to get something out for you guys. I'm going to try to make this as non-trauma dumpy as possible, but this really is a mini episode of my journey. And the hope is that those of you who are also going through grief can take something away from it. So I think to start, grief really does bleed into every part of your life. And if you don't manage it, or at least try to face some of it, you're going to have a awful time later on. It definitely isn't one of those things where time just makes it go away. I especially think for me, it was unfortunate because I just was not allowed the time to process anything. I could not catch my breath. America specifically is really not a grief-friendly country. I was only given 3 days until I had to go back to work, and it's like, all right, but also the whole world keeps moving on without you, but my world was frozen, and it really did stay that way for such a long time. I sunk into a deep depression, continued to work until I couldn't mentally handle it anymore. I was working remotely at the time, and her room was right next to mine, so every day it felt like I was kind of haunted by it. But I wasn't crying. I wasn't seeing anybody about it. I was really just trying to push through it because I felt like that was all I could do at the time. And then at the same time, while I'm struggling to deal with my own grief, certain people in my family are like actively projecting their mixtures of feelings from grief onto me because my whole family's grieving. It's not just me. And then ultimately the person I lived with after my grandmother's death disliked me so much. I felt uncomfortable being there. And, they were planning to move out without me and all these really fucked up things. So I was pretty much forced to move to North Carolina. And once I got there, I'm like, I don't know anybody. I'm working 12 hours a day. I think I worked 12 hours a day for like 14 days straight before work kind of settled. And then that job was miserable, or maybe I was just miserable because of my circumstances, and then it made the job miserable. But didn't know anybody, was working a job that I wasn't having a great time with. And then I attended UNC over there for a semester, and it didn't work out, so I came back to find my apartment padlocked and all of my stuff gone. So just the point of this is that like all of this cascaded from that grief, right? So like death is really inconvenient. It really can be. Thank you, Grandma. So I lost my financial stability, I lost my housing stability, and pretty much everything in my life at the time went to shit. And I think I grew so focused on surviving that my ability to process emotions, like especially sadness and grief, were severely warped to protect myself or numbed. I felt like I quite literally couldn't afford to grieve or I would stop functioning. And while it's not like that for everyone, for most people it is destructive to themselves. Like, how do we even begin to emotionally process such devastating loss? And the answer to that is truly subjective to the individual and really is a journey of healing and definitely growing. I think at first I repressed everything so hard that I said before, my brain really tried to emotionally numb everything. And as a result, and we hear this term used a lot commonly, like the void emerged. So, when you have that void, something's missing or you feel hollow. I felt like I needed to fill that void and I needed a way to cope. And unfortunately, it wasn't a healthy way that I coped. For me, it was sex. And especially I feel like as a male, it gets hard to see the consequences for that because males are unfortunately validated for having a lot of sex sometimes. And I think it got to a point where I was doing it so much, I started to objectify myself, to see myself as only being good for sex. So now grief starts to bleed into my relationships as well, like romantically. And when I got depressed as a result of my grief, I stopped seeing my friends because I just didn't enjoy seeing them anymore. I didn't find enjoyment in things. Or my family, because the way I felt neglected by them, when maybe they also just didn't know how to process that grief either. And so a lot of these things aren't just, oh, woe is me, like I feel bad for me because, this person died. Like, I grew a lot of bad habits or irrational thoughts that I just couldn't control, even if they weren't right. So now I start to kind of spiral, because what if I'm the problem or I'm the bad person? And I think it took a lot of reflection to understand that just because I went through something shitty doesn't mean I can project that on other people. I was effectively becoming the type of person I hated. And so to that end, I really started to try to figure out what my issue was. I actually didn't think my grief was a huge part of whatever I had going on, because in my eyes, I never had an issue talking about, my grandma and the circumstances surrounding her death. So I probably accepted it to some sort of degree, right? No, not at all. Wrong. I was probably doing what's called intellectualizing, which is sort of just using rationality to block your emotional responses to a conflict. It's not the same as actually opening up about the issue. So being vulnerable is just not the same as talking about it. So I was just intellectualizing everything, trying to make reasons or justify things for all of my behaviors. And I think the truth was, and part of it still is, that even if I was right or wrong about the things that I theorized, things wouldn't change unless I actually acted on it. And I didn't act on it for a long time, and the reasons for that were probably just excuses. Truthfully, I think I was just afraid to face her death, because I had grown so used to functioning based on rationality, logic, and staying afloat. And the idea of feeling something about it just wasn't even an option in my mind. But I think as time went on, the dysfunctional emotional processing and difficulty with relationships, it starts to get to you. You start to question if there's something wrong with you and your self-worth, and that really took a toll on me. So I decided to start group therapy and individual therapy. And I'm not here to say that it's a miracle, but I've definitely seen improvement. Group specifically is really hard. There's a lot of stuff that goes on that is difficult to do and difficult to face. And you're going to feel some things, and, I felt a lot of things, and I felt like there was a lot of things I just didn't want to do. But I think there's a level of, uncomfortability that you have to get in order to really see results. I think I cried for the first time in years after a group therapy session, and individual therapy has helped me really identify my deep-rooted issues to start unraveling them, little by little. And so I really wanted to share this story because I know there are people out there who have also experienced loss and also have trouble dealing with it. There's no right way to go about it, or wrong way. Well, there are wrong ways, I would say. I don't think unhealthy coping mechanisms are good. People are going to fall into them, but I think, for example, my coping mechanism, I don't think that's the right way to go about it. I do think it's not a good way to go about it. But grief is unique to the individual. But I do think that there are things everyone can do to get help, and I think that there are resources for those who need them. So take that walk today, hang out with your friends, go to therapy, say a prayer, visit your loved one's grave, whatever it is. You are a stronger person as a result of the loss, and while it never go away, it can be easier to manage. We should look at our grief as the love we never got to express to the person we loved, rather than a burden to carry for the rest of our lives. Thank you guys so much for tuning into this episode. I will see you guys next Monday as usual. I know I strayed a bit, but it's her birthday today. Gotta honor her somehow. And I'll see you next week.